conclusion is that no reason was offered for going to war. That is, no reason that could not be refuted in a moment by a literate teenager. However, it was not necessary to offer a reason because the media and the educated classes generally simply marched on command. They did not point out that that reason was totally fraudulent and that whatever the reason is, it's something different than that. Now, that's the very hallmark of a totalitarian culture.
Propaganda? In the United States? In the pre-Glasnost Soviet Union, maybe, or perhaps in the People's Republic of China. But here in a free society? Well, we may not call it by that name, but Noam Chomsky says that the rulers of the United States are even more inclined to rely on propaganda to achieve public consensus favorable to their goals than a totalitarian state would be. Chomsky, a world-renowned linguist, author, and critic of U.S. foreign policy, argues that using force to suppress ideas is less politically acceptable in our society than in others, so that the manipulation of public opinion becomes all the more important. Hello, I'm Robert Foxworth, and this is American Dialogues. In part one of this two-part American Dialogues edition with Noam Chomsky, we explore our government's manipulation of information and the media's cooperation with it, especially in regard to the coverage of the war against Iraq. We open with Noam Chomsky speaking in Los Angeles at an event organized by the New York-based media watch group FAIR, and then join him in an interview.
In any system of governance, no matter how it's constituted, there's going to be a major problem. The major problem is how to secure obedience from the primary enemy of the governors, namely the domestic population. And in order to achieve this, there are going to have to be ideological institutions and cultural managers, what we might call a commissar class, perhaps a bit unkindly. They can do it in various ways. They can achieve obedience by direct orders, if it's the kind of society where force is at the ready and people recognize it. Or if not, they have to turn to other devices. And there aren't really all that many of them, so we see them used over and over again. There's fear, diversion, deception, or often just silence, often the most effective. Silence often imposes assumptions. If nothing is discussed, you just assume it's true. So, for example, take, say, the Gates hearings. I thought one of the most remarkable things that happened there, actually the most interesting thing that was revealed, was a memorandum that the New York Times actually published. It was a memorandum of December 1984 from Robert Gates to William Casey, the CIA director, which started by saying that we have to start talking tough about Nicaragua. We have to rid the hemisphere of this regime. And we have to do that by any means necessary, up to bombing, if that will be politically possible. And if we don't do this, if we don't rid the hemisphere of this regime by any means possible, then that shows that we have abandoned the Monroe Doctrine. Well, actually, he's kind of accurate. If you look back at the history of the Monroe Doctrine, that's exactly what it meant. It said that we should run the hemisphere by whatever means are feasible. But what was most interesting, actually I gave a talk in Detroit the evening that came out, and I suggested to the audience that they have a look and see how much comment there's going to be on it, either in Congress or in the media. And I've checked, and maybe you have, and I found none. I mean, there was occasionally you would find a sentence saying Gates was tough on Nicaragua, but the idea that there should be something wrong with having the head of the leading secret subversive agency, the leading criminal agency, who takes the position that we have the right to rid the hemisphere, or for that matter the world, of anybody who's in our way. Nobody seems to think that there's anything wrong with that, either in Congress or in the media. And that's very in a way, the most frightening thing that happened at the hearings. But the failure to discuss these things also has its meaning. Its meaning is to instill the understanding that that's the way the world is supposed to be run and that that's right and good. Well, silence can also be a form of thought control. The only kind of a system, social system, in which there wouldn't be ideological institutions devoted to thought control and commissars to run them, the only kind of social system that could depart from this would be one in which there is no class of rulers separate from the population. That is, a democratic society with libertarian social forms and meaningful participation on the part of the general population in management of public affairs and their individual lives, with an equitable distribution of decision-making power and resources generally. But a democratic society, democracy in general, is a remote ideal and possibly a receding ideal, and it's also a concept that is greatly feared within the dominant culture and always has been. That's something important to recognize both in the study of domestic policy and of foreign policy. In the real world, there are various kinds of anti-democratic authoritarian systems, and they range over a spectrum. There's a kind that we call totalitarian societies, where power typically resides primarily in the state, which rules largely by force, although thought control is also necessary. In a totalitarian society, the ideological institutions follow state orders, and the commissar class likewise. And the system of control is usually pretty transparent. Now, that's, of course, only an ideal. Societies only approximate to that to one or another extent. So, for example, in the Soviet Union, which is was pre-Gorbachev, near the totalitarian end of the spectrum, the political class, the political leadership and the military leadership were very indignant about the fact that they had such an adversarial press. It's literally true that they bitterly denounced the press during the war against Afghanistan because the press was too pessimistic and it wasn't giving an upbeat enough account of the Soviet defense of Afghanistan against terrorists supported by the CIA. And it reported the travail of Soviet soldiers and so on and so forth. In fact, the criticisms that were made by the Communist Party bureaucracy and the top military of the highly conformist Soviet press in this near totalitarian state, those criticisms had a very familiar ring. They're exactly the kind of criticisms that are made of our press from on high for being too adversarial and too critical, and they're about as accurate, I should say. That's totalitarian societies. In what are called democratic societies, power typically resides in a state-corporate nexus, closely interlinked. The ideological institutions are part of it. The media are, of course, major corporations, part of larger conglomerates, close interactions with the state authorities. The cultural managers in the universities and the schools and the media either are just part of the system themselves or adapt to it or are, if more independent, pretty narrowly constrained by limits that it imposes. There's a huge corporate industry, the public relations industry, which is committed to, as they put it, control of the public mind, and permeates just about every aspect of our waking lives, and is part of the ideological establishment. The reliance on force in a democratic society is much less. It's not zero, but it's much less. That's the result. It's not that they're nice guys. It's the result of centuries of popular struggle, which have simply taken force away from the governors, so it's not available to them to the extent that it ever was. And that means that means of thought control and diversion are more significant. In fact, there's a general rule, I think, across which you see if you look comparatively over history and across societies, that the more that to the extent that the governors, the state, loses the capacity to control by force, its elites will turn more to more sophisticated and more extensive techniques of thought control. And that's a very natural correlation if you keep to the general assumption, and it is a general one, that the worst danger, the one that must be averted at all costs, is meaningful democracy. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that in the United States, which is in many ways the freest society in the world and has been for a long time, in the United States, this doctrine that democracy is an evil that must be we must defend ourselves against, that's accepted doctrine. If, at least by democracy, we mean something like the ability of people to, if we mean that a society is democratic insofar as it provides means by which ordinary people can exercise meaningful control over public affairs. If that's what we mean by democracy, the dictionary meaning, then it has always been regarded as a tremendous danger. The founding fathers, one of their leading maxims was that the people who own the country ought to govern it. And that's the way the original compact was established, the original constitutional system was established, and the way it's remained. Going to the modern period, in the 20th century, as state force has declined and correspondingly the means of thought control have increased, there's a substantial literature developing these ideas, not only applying thought control but also explaining why it's necessary. You find this all over the place. It's a large part of the academic profession. It's in the literature of the public relations industry. In fact, it's in the general literature. Now, there's nothing specific to the United States about this, and there's nothing new about it either. These ideas you can trace back to the earliest period in modern times when there were democratic revolutions, challenges to authority, challenges to feudalism, and so on. First major challenge, modern challenge, was in the 17th century in England, in the mid-17th century, when there was a significant democratic uprising, was crushed by force, and that led to immediate fear on the part of elite elements. The fear was that, as they put it, the organizers, the itinerant preachers and the printers with their pamphlets and so on, were stirring up the rascal multitude against the men of best quality. And that had to be stopped because, as John Locke, who's regarded as a great libertarian thinker, believed that the general public should not even be granted the right to discuss public affairs. That's too much interference. Well, we've changed a little, but the basic principles remain.
In our interview, we asked Professor Chomsky to elaborate on the idea of cultural managers.
That's constant. In fact, any state, our state or any other state, regards the population as an enemy. It's the domestic enemy. In fact, they even concede it sometimes. So, for example, when Reagan's Office of Public Diplomacy, this propaganda agency, the largest one in American history, when it was exposed, and in fact exposed as illegal, although no one cares about that, when it was finally exposed, one high administration official who was involved in it described its actions to the press as the kinds of actions you carry out in enemy territory. Well, that's a proper term. This was their war against the domestic enemy. I should say that not just and elite groups in general regard the public this way. The public is a threat. The public is a threat that has to be controlled. This is a quite explicit position. In fact, it's a position among so-called conservatives. It's not even hidden. It's interesting to notice that on the liberal side, the same view is taken. So if you read if one really studies the literature on democratic theory, you find this pointed out constantly. So let's take, say, Walter Lippman, who's regarded as a leading progressive theorist of liberal democracy. in his political essays, primarily in the 1920s, and of course is the dean of American journalism. He discussed this question over and over again as a progressive. And what he pointed out is that he said that in a properly functioning democracy, you have to distinguish two classes of citizens with two different functions. One class of citizens is what he called the specialized class. That's a very small group. These are what he called the responsible men. These are the people who must have the authority to analyze, to make decisions, to execute those decisions, to act in what he called the common interest. And he said the common interests elude the general public and must be handled by this specialized class. So that's one small group, maybe 10, 15% of the population, or maybe less. Then there's the other class of citizens, which he called the bewildered herd. And he said we, the specialized class, we must protect ourselves from the trampling and the rage of the bewildered herd. These people simply cannot understand. They're too stupid, they're too ignorant. We've got to protect ourselves from them. They have a function. This is a democracy, not a dictatorship, so they have a function too. Their function, he said, is to be the spectators of action, not participants. They're allowed to do something. Every once in a while, they're allowed to throw their weight behind one or another member of the specialized class. That's what we call an election. In other words, if there's a tactical dispute among the small leadership group, then the general public is allowed to say, we want you to lead us, not us. But that's the limit of their participation in a democracy. And to keep them marginalized, apathetic, disoriented, and out of trouble, basically, a whole series of devices are needed to divert the attention of the public. There's a kind of an ideal of democracy that underlies this. The ideal of democracy is that the general public, the overwhelming majority of the public, are isolated, lack any form of organization or association. Each individual is glued to the tube, looking at the propaganda pouring into him, not in a position to discover what he or she thinks, which is always done in association with others, let alone to act on those ideas or to formulate programs or put them forth. That's not their function. They watch, they are spectators. They have to be inundated with propaganda, not only appropriate beliefs about the world, but also appropriate values. So they have to be taught that the only thing you are is a consumer. You're supposed to purchase goods. You're supposed to look like those people on the sitcom. The only value in your life is greed. Maximize your own consumption, and of course work when you're told to work. That's your job. Anything beyond that is wrong. And this message is drilled into your head from childhood, morning through night, as are the appropriate patriotic slogans, beliefs about the world, and so on, or else these people simply have to be distracted. I mean, it's fine, for example, if they're, say, watching the Super Bowl or something like that. Anything but trying to act, but being participants in the world. That they're not allowed to be. That's the ideal of democracy, and it's quite explicit. I mean, and in fact, there's the rationale behind it. The rationale is the general public are too stupid and ignorant to be able to play any meaningful role. If they become involved in affairs, it'll just be a disaster. So therefore, for their own good, we've got to keep them apathetic and marginalized, just as you don't allow a 3-year-old to run across the street. In fact, these doctrines go right back to the 17th century.
Is there any truth in that idea, that theory?
Well, I think there is, first of all, there are 2 points to be made. Point number 1, there is not the slightest reason to believe that the so-called specialized class has any particular intellectual abilities or relevant knowledge. It's enough to look at history to demonstrate that. The problems of the world are complicated, but they're not beyond the reach of the ordinary person. And those who form the specialized class do not reach that position because of any special talent, except for the talent of serving power. They have the talent of, in fact, some of them are honest enough to say so. So, for example, Henry Kissinger, in one of his academic essays, discussed what he called the expert. He said the expert is a person who is able to articulate the consensus of his constituency, meaning people with power. That's what makes him an expert. And that's basically accurate. Furthermore, even if there were any truth to this, it's a value in itself. It doesn't have to be defended. It's a value in itself that people have a right and a responsibility, in fact, to take a meaningful part in managing their own affairs. Now, that's the right that we should defend, and as participants in a society that they don't want us to participate in, we should try to build the organizational structures that allow us to act that way.
Let's talk about the media for a second, which we tend to accept as independent, whether it be print or electronic media. You refer to it as a propaganda system. As a basis for our discussion here, can you explain why, what features make it a propaganda system?
Well, I think the easiest way to demonstrate it is just by illustration. So, for example, let's take the government position on the Gulf War. One reason was offered for going to war over and over, for rejecting negotiations and the possibilities of diplomacy. That reason was, as Bush put it, principles cannot be compromised, aggressors cannot be rewarded. Now, any rational person would at once ask, is that George, let's agree that principles cannot be compromised. Is it George Bush's principle that aggressors cannot be rewarded? Well, I mean, any literate teenager could answer that question in about a minute. George Bush is the one head of state in the world who stands condemned before the World Court for aggression, for the unlawful use of force. George Bush is the head of state who opened the post-Cold War era by invading Panama and would have been censured by the United Nations, except that he vetoed 2 Security Council resolutions condemning that invasion. George Bush was the head of the CIA when Indonesia invaded East Timor and annexed it, killing about 200,000 people. And in fact taking over its extensive oil resources, which are now being exploited by Western countries along with Indonesia. He, as vice president, his administration vetoed a series of Security Council resolutions to try to block Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, and we can go on and on. I mean, the man's record is one of total, complete support for aggression. Now, when he says principles can't be compromised, aggressors cannot be rewarded, the reaction of any independent person would be to collapse in ridicule. The reaction of the media was quite different. With something like 100% unanimity, they stood in awe over his high principles. As the New York Times put it, the principles that were baked into his soul at Andover and Yale, that's what we have to admire. Similarly, when George Bush said, notice that there's a conclusion from that. The conclusion is that no reason was offered for going to war. That is, no reason that could not be refuted in a moment by a literate teenager. However, it was not necessary to offer a reason because the media and the educated classes generally simply marched on command. They did not point out that that reason was totally fraudulent and that whatever the reason is, it's something different than that. Now, that's the very hallmark of a totalitarian culture. You go to war without offering a reason, and nobody cares among the educated classes. Similarly, when Bush said, as he repeatedly did, there will be no negotiations, there were 100 editorials the next day, predictably, praising him for his extraordinary efforts at diplomacy or going the last mile for peace. This was quite extreme. Let me give one example to illustrate how extreme this was. A few days before the air war began, a national poll was published in the Washington Post in which people were asked, do you think we should accept a settlement if Iraq withdraws from Kuwait in return for consideration of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israel-Palestinian conflict? Well, about 2/3 of the population answered yes to that. And that's a very interesting fact, because if you look at the people who answered yes on that question, it's a near certainty that none, or virtually none of them, had ever heard anyone advocate that position. There was no discussion of that possibility in the press. It was never discussed as something that might be pursued. Orders from Washington were opposed to linkage, and therefore everybody was naturally opposed to linkage because you follow your orders. It's also a near certainty that none of the people who voted who answered yes knew that just 1 week earlier, U.S. officials had released an Iraqi proposal offering to withdraw under exactly those terms. On January 2nd, U.S. officials in Washington released an Iraqi offer to withdraw totally from Kuwait, no border issues, in return for General Security Council consideration of two major issues. One, the elimination of weapons of mass destruction from the region, and two, the Israel-Palestine problem. Well, no one could have known that except by the most remarkable accident, because it was almost totally suppressed by the media. Now, here we have to ask ourselves the following question. Suppose that respondents on that poll had known that the proposal that was presented to them as hypothetical was in fact quite realistic. In fact, U.S. officials had released it as an Iraqi proposal, and calling it serious, incidentally, and as indicating an Iraqi intention to withdraw from Kuwait. The U.S. had instantly rejected it, saying there will be no negotiations, forget it. Suppose also that they had seen the issue discussed. That is, it had been that what they really believed in their heart of hearts had actually been discussed seriously in the press or elsewhere. Well, in that case, I think that it wouldn't have been 2/3 of the population. It probably would have been 95% of the population. You make your own guess. And that would have meant that the administration would have been compelled to do what virtually the entire world wanted, including the Iraqi democratic opposition, namely pursue the possibility that the issue could be resolved without killing hundreds of thousands of people, destroying two countries, and creating an ecological catastrophe. However, the media did their job. No one knew these facts. No one had seen the issue discussed. And in fact, there was then no particular reason not to support the president when he went to war as what appeared to be a last resort. Well, in this respect, it is quite fair to call it a media war. The media, by performing very much in the style of a totalitarian state, though without any pressure or state command, created a situation in which the administration was able to follow its plan from early August to eliminate the possibility of a political settlement and to settle the issue by force, as they wanted to do.